In the midst of a business dinner, Edward Hale found himself interrupted by a small voice. "Pardon me, good sir." He glanced over to see a small girl with sparkling blue eyes gazing up at him. With a moment of uncertainty, she raised her wrist, exposing a birthmark that mirrored his perfectly. "My mother once shared with me that if I ever encountered someone possessing this," she softly said, "he could be my father." The surroundings dissolved into nothingness. His history had just caught up with him, and it bore his gaze. Edward Hale occupied a table in one of the city's priciest dining establishments, a venue renowned for its assurance of privacy and flawless service. The evening unfolded as expected, a familiar business dinner, a deal slowly taking shape, another night where every detail aligned perfectly. He seemed somewhat detached from the dialogue unfolding at his table. While his business partners engaged in discussions about market expansions and potential acquisitions, Edward's thoughts drifted to other matters. He had constructed his empire through unwavering discipline and meticulous strategy. Yet recently, an inexplicable emptiness had started to creep in. He brushed it off as mere fatigue. As he swirled the wine in his glass, a slow breath escaped him, his keen blue eyes surveying the shadows of the dimly lit restaurant. The gathering was brimming with the city's most distinguished figures, including politicians, celebrities, and executives akin to him. This place exuded a sense of familiarity, a comforting predictability. A soft voice emerged, cutting through the gentle murmur of chatter. "Pardon me, good sir." Edward glanced over, taken aback. A small girl, perhaps no more than 8, stood next to his table. Her long, wavy blonde hair cascaded around her delicate features, while her strikingly bright blue eyes held an uncanny familiarity. She grasped a napkin in her delicate hands, twisting it anxiously. Edward scowled. It was common for affluent families to take their children to upscale dining establishments, yet there was something distinctly unique about this girl. She was alone. He looked around, anticipating a hurried parent to appear, yet no one approached. "Are you feeling disoriented?" he inquired, his tone steady yet tinged with intrigue. She paused, a moment of uncertainty flickering across her face before she finally shook her head. "Negative. Where might your parents be?" Once more she paused. Then, with a gentle motion, she reached out her delicate hand toward him. And that was the moment he laid eyes on it. A mark of origin. Not just any birthmark, but his birthmark. The identical form, positioned precisely on her wrist just like the one on his arm. His breath hitched in his throat. The eatery slipped quietly into the periphery. The sounds surrounding him faded into a haze. The young girl's azure gaze met his, probing, anticipating. Then she spoke once more, her voice gentle yet resolute. "My mother mentioned that if I ever encounter someone who shares my birthmark, I should let him know." Edward's grip on his wine glass grew firmer. His heart raced within him. "What should I say to him?" he inquired, his tone now subdued. She took a breath, then softly uttered the words that broke his reality. "That you could possibly be my father." Edward gazed intently at the girl, his fingers clenching the stem of his wine glass with increasing intensity. His thoughts wrestled with the weight of the revelation he had just encountered. The words seemed otherworldly beyond belief. His offspring. Negative. It must have been an error. He examined her features, looking for a hint of recognition beyond the birthmark. Her golden tresses, her vivid azure gaze. There was an undeniable allure to them, a likeness he couldn't overlook. The restaurant surrounding him blurred into a mere echo. The men at his table fell into a hush, sensing an odd tension in the air, yet Edward remained oblivious to their presence. All his attention was directed towards the young girl before him, eagerly anticipating his reply. "Could you repeat that?" he inquired, his tone subdued, exhibiting greater restraint. The girl paused, her weight shifting from one foot to the other. She looked down at the napkin in her hands, as if summoning her resolve. "My mother mentioned that if I ever encountered someone with this birthmark," she said, raising her delicate wrist once more, "I should inform him, as it could signify that he is my father." Edward took a deep breath, his thoughts swirling rapidly. Only one individual possessed the knowledge to convey that to her. "Who is your mom?" he inquired, fully aware of what the response would be. The girl paused, her lips sealing together briefly before she finally uttered her words. Lillian Brooks. The name struck him with the force of a blow to the stomach. Though years had passed since he last heard it, the name remained etched in his memory. Lillian had once been a remarkable presence in his life, a person who embraced him even with all his imperfections. Yet he had turned his back, firmly believing that love and family would merely hinder his progress. He had embraced ambition, and now before him stood the result of that decision. Edward rose from his seat, his figure looming over the petite child. His heart raced, yet his face betrayed nothing. "Where is your mother at this moment?" The young woman averted her eyes. Her delicate fingers gripped the napkin tightly. She passed away last month." Edward felt a constriction in his chest. Lillian had vanished. Years had passed since he last laid eyes on her, and she had faded from his thoughts just as quickly. Now, the finality of never seeing her again settled heavily in his heart. The weight of it struck him with an intensity he hadn't anticipated. He let out a breath, finding his balance. He mustn't let go of his composure, not in this moment, not in this place. He shifted his focus back to the girl, his offspring. "May I ask what your name is?" he inquired. She raised her eyes, her vivid blue orbs brimming with an indefinable emotion. "Emily," she whispered gently. The name resonated in his thoughts, both strange and known simultaneously. Edward surveyed the surroundings of the restaurant. The scene was beginning to attract attention. He preferred not to engage in this discussion in such a public setting, surrounded by the inquisitive gazes of onlookers. He cast a glance over his shoulder at Emily. "Join me," he said, his tone resolute yet gentle. After a brief pause, she gave a nod of agreement. Edward gently rested his hand on her petite shoulder, steering her toward the exit. The business dinner had concluded. Everything in his life had just shifted. Edward guided Emily out of the restaurant, his thoughts still swirling. The valet presented him with his keys, and he gracefully opened the door to his polished black car, gesturing for her to enter. She paused briefly before getting in, gripping the seatbelt with delicate fingers, uncertain of her next move. He eased into the driver's seat, his fingers curling around the steering wheel as he cast a quick glance her way. She appeared diminutive in the expansive leather seat, her blue eyes flitting between him and the strange environment. "Where have you been residing?" he inquired as he merged onto the road. Emily adjusted her position in her chair. "In the company of Miss Karen. She lives next door to us." She welcomed me in after, her voice fading as she clutched the edge of her dress. "Yet she mentioned that I can't remain indefinitely." Edward let out a breath through his nostrils, his grip on the wheel tightening. The thought that his daughter, his beloved child, had been entrusted to a neighbor following her mother's passing stirred a profound turmoil within him. Lillian ought to have confided in him. He ought to have been aware. He compelled himself to maintain a steady tone. "What happened prior to that? Has your mother ever brought me up?" Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. "She told me you were important, that you had a lot on your plate. She remarked that you had your own existence." Edward tightened his jaw. He could hear Lillian's voice, gently shaping the truth to ensure that Emily wouldn't harbor resentment for a man she had never known. She ought to have confided in him. He choked back the irritation bubbling within him. "Did she ever explain why she kept you a secret from me?" Emily dismissed the idea with a shake of her head. "Absolutely not. She merely remarked that you weren't prepared at that time." The impact of the words was more profound than he had anticipated. He felt the urge to dispute it, to reject the notion, yet within the depths of his being, he recognized the undeniable truth. 8 years prior, he would have been at a loss when it came to handling a child. He had scarcely grasped the art of self-care during that time, utterly absorbed in his profession to contemplate anything beyond it. But now, sitting in the car with his daughter, his precious daughter, everything felt different. He cast another look in her direction. "Is there something you have on hand?" apparel, playthings. Emily gently shook her head. Miss Karen packed a small bag, yet I chose to leave it behind. I wasn't sure if you would like me to join you. Her voice was soft and hesitant, and the way she spoke sent a flutter of unease through Edward's stomach. Certainly, I desire your presence alongside me, he stated, with a conviction that surprised even him. Emily's head pivoted in his direction, her blue eyes shimmering with an enigmatic expression. He cleared his throat, attempting to dispel the strange heaviness that clung to his chest. Tomorrow we will collect your belongings. This evening you will be by my side. She gave a slight nod, remaining silent. The remainder of the journey unfolded in quietude, yet it carried no sense of discomfort. Emily gazed out as the city lights streaked by her window, her delicate hands resting quietly in her lap. As they arrived at his residence, an elegant, contemporary mansion tucked away in the serene outskirts of the city, Emily's lips parted just a bit. "This is your home?" she inquired, her voice soft and hesitant. Edward cast his eyes upon the grand house, its meticulously tended lawns and lofty windows shimmering in the gentle light of the street lamps. He had never truly contemplated it prior, but indeed it was substantial, chilly, crafted for an individual who had never anticipated the presence of another in his domain. Indeed, he replied with simplicity. Emily lingered in her gaze for a heartbeat longer before giving a subtle nod. She remained silent on her feelings about it. He exited the vehicle, making his way to her side to open the door for her. She emerged gradually, her eyes darting back and forth between him and the house. "Let's go," he said, his hand resting gently on her back as he led her to the front door. Upon entering, they were enveloped by the stillness of the home. The lofty ceilings and expansive area that once felt familiar now appeared desolate. Emily moved cautiously, glancing around with a sense of disbelief, as though she were unsure of her place in this moment. "This place is enormous," she finally remarked. Edward exhaled softly. "I guess it is." She glanced over at him. "Are you residing here by yourself?" He paused for a moment before giving a nod. "Absolutely." Emily observed him intently for a prolonged moment before shifting her gaze elsewhere. "It has a certain vibe. Calm." Edward felt an unsettling weight in his chest from her words, though he couldn't quite understand why. He waved his hand toward the staircase. "Let's go. I will guide you to your room." Emily ascended the stairs behind him, her delicate footsteps whispering against the gleaming floors. He guided her to a guest room, one among many, though he had never truly occupied any of them. The space was immaculate, the bed perfectly arranged, the design understated. It served its purpose. Void. Emily lingered in the doorway, surveying her surroundings. "It's pleasant," she remarked, yet her tone lacked any genuine feeling. In a moment of clarity, Edward came to understand just how ill-equipped he truly was for this situation. The room felt empty, devoid of toys, stuffed animals, or any sense of warmth. Nothing that truly belonged to her. "We'll get you things tomorrow," he murmured, his words directed more inwardly than toward her. Emily nodded, but then paused, uncertainty flickering across her face. "May I pose a question to you?" Edward shifted his gaze toward her. "Absolutely." She gazed up at him, her cerulean eyes filled with intensity. "Will you hold on to me?" His stomach tightened. "Keep you," he repeated, taken aback by the wording. Emily adjusted her stance. "Miss Karen expressed uncertainty about my future destination. She mentioned that you might hesitate to accept me since I wasn't on your radar before." Edward took a deep breath, stifling the unexpected surge of feelings that washed over him. He spoke with caution, revealing, "I wasn't aware of your existence until now. However, at this moment I have come to understand." He lowered himself just enough to meet her gaze. "Emily, you're staying right here." She gripped the hem of her dress with a subtle tension in her fingers. "Is that a guarantee?" He maintained her gaze. "I assure you." For the first time since departing the restaurant, Emily's posture eased a bit. She nodded, releasing a soft sigh. "Understood." Edward rose to his feet, observing her as she approached the bed and slipped beneath the covers. She appeared small in comparison to the vast bed, yet there was no hint of fear in her demeanor. He began to walk away, yet just before he could grasp the doorknob, her soft voice called out to him once more. "Wishing you a peaceful night, Father." Edward stood still. He tightened his grip on the doorknob. He dedicated his existence to crafting a realm devoid of emotions, a space where connections were mere hindrances. Yet, in just one night, everything transformed. He tilted his head ever so slightly, his voice softer than normal. "Sweet dreams, Emily." He turned off the light, closed the door, and for the first time in years, he understood that he was no longer alone. Edward hardly found rest that night. For years, he meticulously managed every facet of his existence. His business, his image, his daily habits. Yet, everything seemed insignificant in light of the reality that, just beyond the wall, his 8-year-old daughter lay sleeping in a bed that was not her own, in a house that had never been intended for a child. He lingered in his softly illuminated office, gazing out at the sprawling city skyline through the expansive windows that reached from floor to ceiling. The glass mirrored his expression, analytical and taut, yet underneath lay an unfamiliar sensation, uncertainty. He was completely lost in his actions. For years, he convinced himself that feelings were flaws, that connections were mere diversions, that his craft was the sole priority. Yet, there was a young girl down the hall who had lost her mother, who had endured weeks of uncertainty, and who had asked him, with a sincerity that pierced the heart, "Are you going to keep me?" Edward shut his eyes for a moment, massaging his temples gently. He was completely unaware of her existence. He ought to have been seething with anger at Lillian for keeping the truth from him, for robbing him of his decision. Yet, what troubled him even more was the image of Emily enduring the aftermath of her mother's loss, lingering in uncertainty, hoping for someone to come forward and claim her, oblivious to whether that moment would ever arrive. The thought of her feeling unwanted caused a tightness in his chest. In the quiet hours of the morning, fatigue finally took hold, and he succumbed to slumber in the chair. As he stirred from his slumber, the subtle rustle of activity beyond his office door beckoned his attention. Edward propped himself up, his fingers brushing against his face as he glanced at his watch. It was almost 7 o'clock. He had slept in, a rare occurrence for him. He rose and moved into the hallway, discovering Emily by the staircase, gazing over the railing. She pivoted at the sound of his voice, her vivid blue eyes expanding just a touch. "I had no idea where to go," she confessed, adjusting her stance. "I hoped to let you rest undisturbed." Edward paused, grappling with the newness of sharing his space with another person. "You can wake me if you need to," he said, his voice gruffer than he meant to convey. Emily observed him intently for a moment, then gave a nod of understanding. "Do you feel a craving for something to eat?" he inquired after a moment of silence. She gave another nod. Edward found himself pondering why this idea hadn't crossed his mind sooner. He was accustomed to having his meals catered by staff or dining at his office, but today felt distinct. "Let's go," he urged, gesturing toward the stairs. She trailed behind him silently as they navigated toward the kitchen. The area exuded a contemporary elegance, featuring stainless steel appliances and marble countertops, resembling a showroom rather than a space that had been inhabited. Emily ascended to one of the bar stools at the island, observing him intently. "Are you familiar with the art of cooking?" Edward exhaled softly. "Not quite." Her lips were tightly sealed, as though she were battling the urge to smile. "Mom excelled at it." He halted by the fridge, casting a glance back at her over his shoulder. "What did she prepare for breakfast?" Emily's fingers danced across the counter, creating intricate patterns, primarily pancakes. She mentioned that they were simple. Edward swung the fridge door wide, his eyes darting across the shelves. He discovered eggs, milk, and a box of pancake mix. He was capable of achieving this. He had negotiated billion-dollar deals. Surely he could manage pancakes. He arranged the ingredients on the counter, glancing over to see Emily observing him with a hint of doubt in her eyes. "What is happening?" he inquired. She merely shrugged her shoulders. You don't strike me as someone who enjoys pancakes. Edward lifted an eyebrow in curiosity. How do I come across to you? Emily tilted her head, deep in thought. As if one indulges in copious amounts of coffee and consumes meals straight from their packaging. Edward couldn't help but smirk, even against his better judgment. Close enough. He focused intently on the mixing bowl, striving to adhere to the instructions as accurately as possible. Emily propped her chin on her hands, visibly amused by his attempt. As he poured the batter into the pan, she leaned in a bit closer. Be careful not to turn it over too early, or it might fall apart. Do you possess expertise? She nodded with a sense of gravity. I observed my mother do it frequently. Edward cast a fleeting look in her direction. Then you'll need to ensure I don't make any mistakes with this. Emily's blue eyes shimmered with an enigmatic glint. He was unaware of the significance of the words until he noticed the subtle shift in her expression, a nearly undetectable relaxation of her tension. The initial pancake came out quite satisfactory. The latter was superior. He positioned the plate before Emily and gently set down the syrup. She grasped her fork, savored a bite, and chewed with contemplation. He inquired, arms crossed. They don't quite measure up to Mom's. Edward chuckled softly. Understood. However, she persisted, savoring another bite. They're not unpleasant. He regarded that as a victory. Their meal unfolded in a quietude that felt surprisingly at ease. For the first time since their encounter, Edward felt a sense of grounding, no longer adrift in uncertainty. As Emily completed her meal, she placed her fork down and regarded him with a serious expression. What comes next? Edward let out a breath, placing his coffee on the table. At this moment we unravel the complexities. Emily observed him intently for an extended period. Do you really want to go through with this? Edward maintained his focus on her eyes. Indeed. She appeared to ponder that for a moment, then gave a slow nod. Understood. One solitary term, yet it held immense significance. For the first time, she was allowing herself to embrace the notion that she truly belonged in this place. And Edward was certain, with unwavering conviction, that he would not fail her. The morning following their inaugural breakfast together, Edward discovered himself in uncharted territory. His existence had consistently been governed by structure, precision, and mastery. Yet, suddenly, an 8-year-old girl had entered his life, a daughter he had never known about, completely transforming his world in just a few hours. Emily navigated the house with a sense of trepidation, as though she questioned her right to be present in that space. She refrained from touching anything unless given explicit permission. She made no requests. She remained silent, keenly attentive, studying him as if she were attempting to discern the sincerity behind his words when he offered her a place to stay. Edward found himself at a loss, unsure of how to proceed with that revelation. He dedicated his life to navigating multimillion-dollar negotiations, managing intense situations, and making tough decisions within stringent time constraints. Yet this was unlike anything else. This was not a matter of business. This was genuine. By mid-morning, he came to the unsettling realization that they faced yet another issue. Emily found herself in a space devoid of clothes, possessions, or anything that could claim this house as her own. After many years, Edward stepped into a department store for the first time. Emily stood beside him, her delicate fingers clutching the strap of her bag, as she gazed up at the towering shelves filled with clothes, shoes, and accessories. It was utterly consuming. Choose anything you wish, Edward remarked, maintaining a steady tone. Emily paused, uncertainty flickering in her mind. Is there anything at all? Absolutely. She nibbled on her lip, glancing around once more. Edward noticed the uncertainty reflected in her gaze, the subtle way she fidgeted on her feet as if she struggled to trust his words. I don't require much, she finally stated. One must have sufficient, Edward countered. We're definitely taking more than one outfit with us. Emily offered a subtle nod and began to glide gently down the aisle. She stood apart from the other children he had encountered in stores, devoid of excitement, absent of the usual dash from shelf to shelf, and lacking the impulsive grabbing at items. She exercised caution. Reflective. She selected several items, examined them intently, and then returned the majority to their original place. In the end, she chose a few pairs of jeans, several shirts, a jacket, and a pair of sneakers. Edward scowled. "Is that all?" Emily gave a slight nod. He let out a weary breath. "We'll obtain more later." She gazed at him, her face a mask of mystery. "What is the reason?" "Because you require certain things, Emily," he stated plainly. She observed him intently for a prolonged moment, then gave a slight nod once more. "Understood." Upon completing their checkout, they made a brief stop at a bookstore. Emily strolled through the aisles with newfound assurance, her fingers gliding over the spines of the books. Edward patiently observed her, allowing her the space to thoughtfully select 3. He lifted an eyebrow as she presented them to him. "Just 3?" She gave a slight shrug. "Literature endures through the ages." Edward let out a breath, gently shaking his head. "We'll return once you've completed these." For the first time that day, a smile graced Emily's face. Agreed. The journey back was serene, yet it held a certain ease. She occupied the passenger seat, perusing one of her books, stealing glances at him now and then, as if words lingered on her lips, yet uncertainty held her back. Upon their return to the house, she brought the shopping bags inside, arranging them carefully by the staircase. "There's no need for that," Edward remarked. "I employ a team." "I don't mind," Emily interrupted. She paused, contemplating her next words. "My mother always emphasized the importance of looking after your own belongings." Edward felt an unexpected weight in his chest, the impact of it resonating deeper than he had anticipated. He gave a slight nod. She was likely correct. Emily offered him a faint smile before picking up her bags and making her way upstairs to her room. Edward observed her departure, releasing a slow breath. He had never viewed himself as a parent. He had never imagined himself as a parent, never considered the realities of school, the importance of books, or the number of outfits required for an 8-year-old. Yet here he was, in his own home, observing his daughter as she made herself comfortable in a space that had never been intended for a child, and a realization dawned on him. This was more than merely permitting her to remain. This was about ensuring she always felt a sense of belonging. For the first time in his life, Edward Hale realized that certain matters held greater significance than mere business. One of them was family. That evening, the atmosphere in the house was unmistakably altered. There was a nuance to it, a delicate change in the atmosphere, as if the quiet had lost some of its weight. Edward found himself unfamiliar with this sensation. His residence had consistently been precisely that, his own. Every aspect had been crafted for functionality, for ease, yet lacked a sense of coziness. Upstairs, a child existed, a child of his own, and in that moment, the walls felt less daunting. He sat in his office, striving to make sense of his workload, yet the figures on the screen swirled into a haze. Thoughts of Emily lingered in his mind. Was she finding her place? Did she sense a disconnect? Did she require anything? What troubled him the most was his ignorance of the situation. After several minutes of struggling to concentrate, he slid his chair back and made his way into the hallway. He lingered outside her door, caught in a moment of uncertainty about whether to knock or simply turn and leave. Just as he was about to make up his mind, the door let out a soft creak as it opened a fraction. Emily remained poised, her gaze directed upward at him. She had opted for a different look, donning a slightly oversized t-shirt that likely belonged to her mother instead of the clothes she had chosen earlier. She cradled one of her new books in her hands, her fingers delicately tracing the edges. "Greetings," she remarked. Edward cleared his throat with a deliberate pause. "Hello." She adjusted her stance. "I plan to indulge in some reading before drifting off to sleep." He gave a slight nod. "That's excellent." She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "There were moments when my mother would share stories with me." The phrases lingered in the space that separated them. Edward sensed their heaviness, the silent inquiry lurking beneath. He found himself saying, almost without consideration, that he could read to you. Emily's expression was one of astonishment, as though she had not anticipated his proposal. She observed him intently for a prolonged moment, then gave a nod. Understood. She made her way back to the bed, climbing onto it and drawing the blankets snugly over her legs. Edward took a seat in the chair next to her bed. With a gentle motion, she passed him the book, her azure gaze fixed intently on him as he began to turn the pages. He cast a quick look at the title. It was a story for young readers, yet it carried a profound message, touching on themes of bravery and the journey to discover one's true place. He began to read, his voice unwavering, even as uncertainty lingered about whether he was performing it correctly. Emily remained silent. She simply absorbed the words. As he delved into the third chapter, her eyelids began to grow heavy. She battled against it, striving to remain conscious, but ultimately, her breaths grew steady, and the book fell from her grasp. Edward lingered for a moment, observing her peaceful slumber. She appeared serene, yet a subtle furrow lingered on her brow, as if she feared that upon waking, everything might vanish once more. A tightness coiled within him. He gently placed the book on the nightstand, then rose, carefully draping the blanket over her shoulders. Before departing, he paused. Then, almost instinctively, he extended his hand and gently swept a wayward strand of blonde hair from her forehead. She remained still. He took a step back, casting a final glance her way before extinguishing the light and exiting the room. As he shut the door, a profound understanding washed over him. This went beyond merely providing her with shelter. A place to call her own was essential for her. A household. For the first time, Edward realized he was not merely looking after a child. He was her dad. The following morning, Edward rose earlier than he typically did. His internal clock was honed for productivity, accustomed to early mornings and late nights devoted to his craft. Yet today, an unusual sensation lingered in the air. He took his time, not hurrying to check his emails or get ready for a conference call. Instead, his thoughts drifted immediately to the little girl peacefully slumbering in the adjacent room. His offspring. The words still seemed unfamiliar to him, yet they felt a bit more familiar than they had the previous day. He emerged from his bedroom, hesitating at Emily's door. The door stood a fraction open, and faint sounds of movement drifted from within. He tapped gently. "Come in," called a small voice belonging to Emily. Edward opened the door and discovered her on the floor, meticulously folding the new clothes they had purchased the day before. She meticulously arranged them into tidy stacks on the bed. "There's no need for that," he remarked. "I have a person who can handle the laundry." Emily gave a slight shrug. "I'm perfectly fine with that." She delicately pressed out a crease from the fabric, her nimble fingers moving with precision, as though this modest chore offered her a semblance of order. Edward rested casually against the doorway. "Did you have a restful night?" Emily gave a slight nod. "Indeed." She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Thank you for taking the time to listen to me." A subtle tension gripped his chest at the genuine warmth in her voice. "No problem at all," he replied. "If you'd like, I can do it again tonight." Emily gazed up at him, her blue eyes shimmering with surprise, as though the offer had caught her off guard. She offered a slight nod. "Understood." Edward observed her for a brief moment before he cleared his throat. "It would be wise to have a bite to eat before we head out." Emily inclined her head. Where to go? Edward still hadn't shared the news with her. He was uncertain about her possible reaction. Yet, following the events of the previous night, he understood the course he needed to take. "We will retrieve the remaining items from Miss Cairns." Emily's eyes widened in astonishment. "Ah!" She took a moment to reflect, her thoughts swirling in the silence. "Understood." There was an absence of thrill, no sense of relief, merely a calm acceptance, as if she had conditioned herself to temper her expectations. That felt off to him. "Prepare yourself," he instructed. "We will be departing shortly." Emily acknowledged with a nod and returned to the task of folding her clothes. Edward descended the stairs, his mind occupied with a crucial reminder. This venture extended beyond merely retrieving her belongings. This was about ensuring she understood that it was her home as well. Dog, dog, dog. The journey to Miss Cairns' residence was serene. Emily occupied the passenger seat, her hands poised on her lap, fingers gently drumming against one another. Edward cast a quick look at her as they arrived at the unassuming two-story house. The atmosphere was cozy and welcoming, a setting where a child ought to feel secure. Miss Cairns awaited their arrival on the porch. She was a mature woman with gentle eyes and a weary smile. As soon as she laid eyes on Emily, her expression became gentler. "There's my girl," she said with a gentle warmth. Emily stepped out of the car, pausing briefly before making her way up the steps. Miss Cairns knelt and enveloped her in a tender embrace. Edward observed from a short distance, sensing his role as an intruder in a scene he had no place to disrupt. Miss Cairns gently withdrew, tucking a loose strand of Emily's hair behind her ear with a tender touch. "How are you holding up, dear?" Emily gave a slight nod. Indeed. She cast a quick look at Edward before redirecting her attention to Miss Cairns. "I believe that's the case." Miss Cairns offered a smile, her gaze lingering on Edward as she took a moment to observe him closely. "You must be her dad." It was not a question. Edward locked eyes with her, giving a slight nod. Indeed. Miss Cairns stood, her arms crossed defiantly. "Lillian never mentioned it to you, did she?" Edward tightened his jaw, a subtle shake of his head following. "Absolutely not." Miss Cairns let out a weary sigh. "I suspected as much." She had the desire to. She came close time and again. She cast a fleeting look at Emily. Yet, fear gripped her. She believed you wouldn't have the desire to take on the role of a father. Edward let out a slow breath, his gaze drifting towards Emily. She sat on the porch steps, knees drawn to her chest, absorbing the sounds around her without a word. "She ought to have shared that with me," he murmured softly. Miss Cairns inclined her head in agreement. "Indeed, she ought to have." A pause lingered in the air before she finally broke the quiet. Emily has faced numerous challenges. She experienced the profound loss of her mother. She no longer has a place to call her own. She's been putting on a brave face, but she's still just a young child. She hesitated. "She requires your assistance, Mr. Hale, more than you might think." Edward felt a heaviness in his chest as those words settled in. He acknowledged it. Miss Cairns observed him once more, then offered a slight nod, as if reaching a conclusion. "Her belongings are contained within." I gathered all the items she had left behind. Emily rose to her feet. "I understand it." Edward advanced with purpose. "We will both achieve it." Emily blinked in astonishment but chose not to contest it. Within, the aroma of warm spices enveloped the space, creating an ambience where memories lingered in every nook. Edward observed the framed pictures adorning the walls, featuring some of Miss Cairns' family, alongside a few of Emily too. She was cherished in this place. They took out the small bag of possessions, which was minimal. Just some clothes, a couple of stuffed animals, and a framed photo of her mother. Once all the belongings were loaded into the car, Miss Cairns knelt before Emily once more. "You have my digits, darling. Feel free to reach out to me whenever you need, all right?" Emily nodded, her demeanor composed, yet Edward noticed the subtle tightening of her hands. She restrained her feelings much like he frequently did. Miss Cairns offered a soft smile. "Ensure you prioritize your well-being." Emily took a deep breath, then embraced Miss Cairns in a swift yet firm hug. Edward averted his gaze, allowing them a brief pause. As Emily settled into the car, she exhaled softly, her gaze fixed on the world outside the window. The return journey was even more silent than it had been previously. Edward hesitated, caught in a moment of uncertainty. But eventually, it was Emily who broke the silence. "She tenderly assured me that she would always look after me." Edward acknowledged with a nod, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. "I can perceive." Increased quietude. After a lengthy silence, Emily finally faced him. "Will you also look after me well?" Edward experienced that question as if it were a blow to the heart. He looked at her, noting how she attempted to appear nonchalant, yet the hesitation in her voice betrayed her true feelings. "Indeed," he replied, his voice steady and unwavering. I shall. Emily maintained his gaze for a brief moment before giving a nod. She remained silent, yet there was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a hint of relaxation that hadn't been there before. And for the first time, Edward understood perhaps she was beginning to accept it. That evening, Edward experienced an unfamiliar sensation as he strolled by his office without pausing. His laptop remained idle on the desk, the inbox brimming with emails, but none seemed pressing. His attention was directed to other matters. Emily found herself in her room, carefully unpacking the modest bag of belongings she had brought from Miss Karen's. Since their return, she had remained silent, but it was a different kind of silence than before. This silence wasn't born from doubt. It emerged from the depths of someone grappling with the complexities of a fresh reality. Edward paused for a moment outside her door, his hand hovering before he gently rapped on the wood. "Step inside," Emily invited. He entered the room, surveying his surroundings. The guest room still lacked the essence of a child's domain. It felt overly refined, lacking a personal touch. Emily had thoughtfully arranged her stuffed animals on the bed and positioned the framed photo of her mother on the nightstand. She sat cross-legged on the floor, a book sprawled open before her, yet her gaze wandered elsewhere, far from the pages. "Are you getting comfortable?" Edward inquired. Emily gave a slight shrug. "I suppose." He rested against the doorframe. "I was considering that perhaps we could pick up a few items for your room tomorrow. Transform it into something uniquely yours." Emily glanced upward, her blue eyes brimming with a sense of uncertainty. "What do you mean?" "I'm not sure," he confessed. "Anything you desire. A workspace, fresh linens, perhaps a few prints." Emily bit her lip thoughtfully. "I have never experienced having my own room before." Edward scowled. "You confided in your mother." She gave a slight nod. Though it was modest in size, it exuded charm. He surveyed the chilly, expansive room once more, a space crafted for visitors who would never truly arrive. "This one belongs to you now. It's essential to create that atmosphere." Emily observed him intently for a moment, then gave a nod of understanding. "Understood." Edward let out a breath. "Excellent." She paused, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. "Could we obtain some paint?" He arched an eyebrow. "Are you considering painting the walls?" She gave a slight nod. "My mom allowed me to choose the color in our previous home." Edward had never paused to consider the hue of his walls. The selections were subtle, unassuming, and meticulously curated by a professional in the field of design. Yet, in this moment, he understood for the first time that his choices held no significance. "Which hue?" he inquired. Emily inclined her head, deep in thought. "Azure." Edward wore a subtle smirk. "Statistics." Emily's lips quirked, as if she were stifling a grin. They lingered in silence for a moment before she broke it once more. "Will you still be reading to me tonight?" Edward opened and closed his eyes in quick succession. He had made the offer once, but he never anticipated it would turn into a routine. As he gazed at her, anticipation hanging in the air, he found that he didn't mind at all. "Indeed," he replied. "Select a book." Emily nodded and picked up the one she had been holding earlier, climbing onto her bed with a sense of purpose. Edward settled into the chair next to her, turning to the page she had indicated. He read with a calm voice, and as the words enveloped the space, Emily's stance relaxed. As he delved into the second chapter, she started to blink more slowly, her breathing becoming steadier. Edward shut the book, lingering in the moment before making a move. He observed her slumber, noting how her delicate hands lay gently on the blanket, and how the framed picture of her mother stood nearby, offering a silent comfort. For an eternity, he had believed his existence was complete. His triumph, his influence, his meticulously managed realm, it had sufficed. Yet, in this moment, as he observed his daughter peacefully slumbering, a new understanding dawned upon him. His life had been rather empty. It had been poised for existence. At long last, it came to be. This narrative transcends the mere tale of a wealthy man uncovering the existence of his daughter. It delves into themes of redemption, accountability, and the unforeseen circumstances that compel us to face our histories. Edward Hale starts off as a man who thinks he possesses it all. He wields influence, possesses riches, and commands authority in his realm. Yet, in truth, he finds himself in solitude, his existence meticulously arranged to steer clear of emotional connections. As Emily steps into the scene, the very fabric of his self-perception starts to come apart at the seams. The strength of this narrative lies not only in Edward's discovery of his daughter, but also in his slow evolution into a father figure. Transformation doesn't happen in an instant. Uncertainties, errors, and instances of indecision abound. Yet, as the days unfold, his choice remains Emily, not from a sense of duty, but from genuine desire. Emily, in contrast, is a young soul who has endured significant loss. She treads carefully, unsure if she can trust that Edward will remain. Her modest desires are few, yet it is her silent hope that fuels the profound emotional layers of the narrative. She doesn't require an ideal father. She simply needs someone who will stay. The elegance of the conclusion lies in its straightforwardness. Edward reading to her at night, assisting her in choosing items for her room, assuring her that she is home. These little moments reveal that love transcends grand gestures. It lies in consistency and the act of being present. In the end, this tale revolves around the theme of new beginnings. Sometimes, life surprises you with something you never anticipated, and it reveals itself to be precisely what you needed all along. Edward not only discovered his daughter, but he also uncovered the essential part of his own existence. For the first time, he genuinely grasps the essence of wealth.